Good evening.
This evening we're going to end up in Genesis chapter 18. We're going to start in chapter 12 briefly. So if you want to open up there. Genesis chapter 12, but we'll focus on chapter 18 in just a second. This evening we are doing something not different, but the subject is a little different. And there's a word that we're going to use that we're going to define before we get started. And the word is theophany. And so a theophany comes from Greek, not from the Bible itself, but it describes a biblical event, actually a series of biblical events, which are the appearances of God to humanity. And so it's a compound word. It's the first part is like theology, it's theo, and then you have the rest of it, which kind of sounds like epiphany, but it has that idea of an appearance. And in this case, what we're talking about more specifically is a physical representation of God being presented to a human. And so that would exclude certain things that we might think of, like a vision that someone has where God is in it, or a dream that someone has where God is in it, or when God's voice speaks to someone. But what we're talking about is when God, in a somewhat physical form, appears to a member of humanity, or maybe to put it more simply, a theophany, as we're talking about tonight, is when God chooses to show himself to man. And any time that happens, that's probably worth our taking note of. When the God that created the universe chooses to appear to the eyes of humans that he has made. And so what we're going to do tonight is look at a specific example of that. And I think we'll do that occasionally, at least if this goes halfway decently. But the other thing we might mention is in terms of Theophanies, in the plural, that the first one would be in the Garden of Eden. But we've been talking about that on Wednesday nights, and so we understand that when God appeared to Adam and Eve in the cool of the day, that would be the first theophany, the first time that God appears in a human form to Adam and Eve. And so, as we go into this lesson, we'll also sort of ask the question, well, has anyone really seen God? Because we also, as much as we're talking about the appearance of God, we recognize that in multiple places we're told that no one has ever seen God. And so we'll try to answer that question at least a little bit as far as whether or not someone has seen him. And so, let's start out, like I mentioned, in Genesis chapter 12. And we'll take a look at some of the other encounters that Abraham has with God in different ways. Chapter 12, verse 1, it says, "Now the Lord had said to Abram, get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house to the land that I will show you." And then he gives this great blessing, this great promise to Abram, later to be called Abraham. And so it says here that the Lord had said to Abram. That's about as vague as you can get. We're not really told when he said it, how he said it. All we know is at some point he has told Abraham these words. And so it's not necessarily understood then from that verse that God appeared in any physical form. It's possible, but we're going to talk about one that's much more obvious. Down in same chapter actually, chapter 12, verse 7, it says, "Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said certain things." Well, that's a little bit different. So God appears to Abram. Now again, let me suggest that it doesn't specify how he appears. It just says that he does. It could be that he appears in a physical manifestation, or it could be that he appears to him in a vision, that he appears to him in some other way. But that's just another example we see. Skip on to chapter 15 in verse 1. It says, "After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision." So this time specifically, we are told what's going on, that this image of God is being revealed to Abram through a vision. Well, again, that's not quite the same as what we're talking about with God appearing in a physical form. And then again, this isn't actually to Abraham, but rather to Hagar and her son in chapter 16 and verse 7. It says, "Now the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, and by a spring on the way to Shur, and he said, 'Hagar, Sarai's maid, where have you come from? And where are you going?' And she said, 'I'm fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarai.'" And so it's, in this case, the angel of the Lord being spoken of. we will, time permitting and God willing, address the angel of the Lord on some other occasion. But there's kind of a lot to deal with just as is, and so we'll skip over that until the next time that it comes up. But we do understand the angel of the Lord be a special individual, most likely divine, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. But still, this is talking about Hagar, not Abraham. And so let's get to Abraham now, as he will encounter God. In chapter 18 then, and in verse 1, it starts out saying, "Then the Lord appeared to him by the terebinth trees of Mamre, as he was sitting in the tent door in the heat of the day." Okay, so again here it says that he appears to Abram. That's all it mentions. But there is a little bit of a difference, as we'll see in the rest of the story. It gets into more detail and shows a physical manifestation. But to start with, let's address a couple of things. The first thing is this word of, depending on what translation you're reading, it can read plains of Mamre, or it can read oaks of Mamre, terebinths of Mamre, or maybe a couple of other things as well. Generally, that Hebrew word gets translated as some kind of great tree. And we kind of fill in the blank with trees that we have in mind of great trees. That's why translators choose different things. But it can also rarely be translated as plain. We won't get into why that is. And so that there is a difference there from, say, the King James to other versions. But in this case, what we see is that God chooses to appear to Abraham under essentially a grove of trees. Now, why does he do that? And there's probably a little bit of a temptation to add something mystical or mysterious to this and say, well, maybe it's because he was communing with nature. Maybe that's possible, but all you have to do is go back to chapter 13 and verse 18. And there we find out that the reason that God appears to Abraham here is because this is where Abraham had pitched his tent. This is where Abraham has been living for some time, and so God appears to him where he lives, as it mentions his tent being there as well. And so God does this, and he will appear to Abraham, but it's more than just the Lord by himself. Instead, in verse 2, it says, "So he lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing by him. And when he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them and bowed himself to the ground." So now we have an appearance of the Lord, but we have an appearance of 3 people. Well, that's a little bit strange. That didn't happen in any of the other accounts that we just read of God interacting with Abraham. So what exactly is going on with these 3 individuals? Well, let's start with this. We know from verse 1 of the chapter, your version will say either then the Lord, or then Yahweh, perhaps, or then Jehovah. But the idea is clear, and the Hebrew is clear there to say that it is referring to the personal name of the God of the universe. And so what we're told is, then the God of the universe appeared to him. And so whoever these 3 individuals are, one of them at the very least is God. And so that's why when we look at this particular part of the text, we don't gloss over it like the rest and say, well, maybe he didn't appear in physical form. It was God. It was God, and he did appear in physical form, as we'll find out. He even eats with Abraham. And so that's the first thing that we have to acknowledge. One of these, at least, is the Lord, is Yahweh. And so, with that understanding, the question is, why are there 2 other people? And who are these other 2 people? Some have suggested that this is not just God the Father, that we would normally think of as Yahweh, but rather it is a manifestation of the Trinity. And so the suggestion is that perhaps what Abraham is seeing is not just God the Father, but also God the Son and God the Spirit at the same time, so that he's seeing the entirety of the Godhead coming toward him. Now, that's a very thought-provoking idea. It's interesting, but we would want evidence that that's what's going on. We don't really find it, and we'll talk about that, obviously. But some have suggested that. Usually the evidence that's given in favor of it is that there are 3 people. That aligns with our idea of the Trinity, certainly. That they are worshipped. There's a question there, though. Obviously, God is the only person who is worthy to receive worship, but the question here is, do the others really accept the worship, or is it really directed toward the one that Abraham understands to be the Lord? We can't say one way or the other. And then also looking back into early church history, a lot of the early church fathers did in fact attribute this appearance of God to the Trinity as a whole. And so there were some early Christians that certainly thought along those lines. But in the context, it's a little more difficult to say that that's what's going on. Particularly if you just go on in the text. So it's not necessarily that we're talking about the most conservative approach, which probably would be to say that it was only Yahweh and two other people that weren't part of the Trinity. But go down to verse 22 real quick. In verse 22, after they've had their conversation, or most of it, it says, then the men, verse 22, then the men turned away from there and went toward Sodom, but Abraham still stood before the Lord. Okay, the other two left, but the Lord has remained. Yahweh has remained. That would be enough for us to question if this could be the Trinity. But if you go to the next chapter, it's pretty apparent that this is the same pair that has just left the presence of the Lord and Abraham. Chapter 19, verse 1 says, now the two angels came to Sodom in the evening. And so it appears, if we just let the Bible answer its own question there, that what we're dealing with is an appearance of God, that is Yahweh, God the Father, and two angels. And that should be as simple as we can make it and as difficult as we need to make it. So then we have our answer to this, that God has appeared to Abraham. There is some debate still as to whether this would be God the Father or potentially God the Son. We won't really get into that either. But we just want to understand that Abraham is now encountering the God that created the universe. And he's talking to him face to face, at least in terms of the human flesh that God has chosen to make himself appear in at this time. Now, with that, we're going to ask a couple of other questions, because we can get bogged down pretty easily in the specifics of this and trying to figure out every detail of this interaction. But more importantly than figuring out the angels and God and how all of that works, more importantly, we want to know if the God of the universe decided to speak to man this directly, this intimately, why? What was his purpose in doing so? God does not act like we act. He does not choose to do things on a whim, but he has a plan. He has an intention behind every action. And so the question is, well, why would he appear to Abraham like this? Why wouldn't he just appear to him in a vision again? Why wouldn't he just talk to him from a disembodied voice, as it seems to be on some occasions? Well, that's a good question. So what do we see that he wants to discuss with Abraham? Well, let's start with verse 10. This is Genesis 18 and verse 10. And he said, I will certainly return to you according to the time of life, and behold, Sarah your wife shall have a son. Sarah was listening in the tent door, which was behind him. And now Abraham and Sarah were old, well advanced in age, and Sarah had passed the age of childbearing. Therefore Sarah laughed within herself. And so Sarah is being told what Abraham had already been told. We missed that little bit of context, but back in chapter 17, in verse 17, the same thing was told to Abraham, and he does the exact same reaction as Sarah. He laughs as well, thinking that he who's 100 years old and she who's 90 are a little bit old to be having children. Of course, we would say that that's a bit of an understatement. But the first thing we can say then for God's reason for coming, his purpose in visiting Abraham at this time, is to reaffirm Sarah's child that she's going to have, and maybe to do so more directly than he does the first time. God has already told Abraham. Abraham said, that sounds nice, God, but I don't really think it's going to happen. And then he comes back and he says, no, Abraham, this is really going to take place. Whether you believe it or not, it will happen. And Sarah at this time is also the beneficiary of hearing these words. But she laughs as well. Next thing that happens, let's get down to verse 17 in the same chapter here. God will go on to reaffirm the covenant that he's already made with Abraham. And in verse 17, it says that the Lord said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am doing? Since Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. For I have known him, in order that he may command his children and his household after him, that they keep the way of the Lord, to do righteousness and justice, that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has spoken to him." In terms of the contract then between Abraham and God, this is a pretty important reaffirmation of this, especially considering what we just saw, which is that God said, "I promise to make you a great nation, and I promise to give you a son." And Abraham says, I doubt it. And then he tries to tell him again, and Sarah says, I doubt it. And so God is saying, you know what? Even still, this promise will get fulfilled. Even so, this covenant that I've made with you will continue. And so he's reaffirmed that Abraham indeed will be blessed, and that all nations will be blessed through him. And then the third thing, in verse 20, it says, "And the Lord said, because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very grave, I will go down now and see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry against it that has come to me. And if not, I will know." And so the third thing that God has come for in this case is to pass judgment on these cities that are doing great wickedness. He says in a kind of human-sounding way, I've heard that they're doing wicked things, and I'm coming to check it out. And if it's true, well, then you know what's going to happen. And so God has come for these three specific reasons. Now, why come to Abraham for all of these? Well, the first two are obvious, right? You come to Abraham to tell him that he's going to have this child. You make sure that he knows that. You come to Abraham to tell him, yeah, this promise is still on. I'm going to bless the world through you, through your descendants. But why come to Abraham to tell him about Sodom and Gomorrah? Well, maybe a couple of reasons. One, how would you feel if next week Stanford got demolished by fire from heaven? Would you want to know ahead of time that was going to happen? It'd probably be a good idea. And so God warns him of what's going to happen, but maybe more than that, God seems to be protecting his people, as he always does. God has his chosen people, which usually when we say God's chosen people, we think of the Jews as a whole, or we think of Christians as a whole. At this time in history, who are God's chosen people? Abraham and Sarah. And that's it. Kind of Lot by association. But really it's just those two. And so those two people that are chosen as part of his plan are living near the worst city in the world. And so God might just want to warn them and keep them away from that evil of that place that's so near to them. So God has come for these different purposes. Let's skip down to verse 33, which is the end of the chapter. It says, "So the Lord went his way as soon as he had finished speaking with Abraham, and Abraham returned to his place. And so the Lord comes as quickly as he went, and evidently he had accomplished the purpose that he came for. And hadn't he done that? He had already told Abraham what he needed to know. If you want to boil it down to the point of maybe making it overly simple, God has come to show that he is going to give grace through the birth of this child and to the family of Abraham, who's undeserving of this promise, and that he's also coming to give judgment. Wasn't that most every time that God comes to the world, that he shows his mercy and his justice? And so those two things being accomplished, he leaves for now. And this theophany then that we're talking about is finished. And so what do we take away from this? What can we learn from looking at this one encounter of the God that created everything, encountering the creatures that he had made? The first thing we might want to mention is the question that we had from near the beginning, which is this question again from the New Testament especially, but in the Old Testament also, of who has seen God? Because we're told that no one has seen God, and yet we see encounters like this, where it's not really in our ability to debate, because the term Yahweh is being used. He appears in physical form. He eats a meal with a human. And so, did Abraham see God? Well, yes. He sat across the table from God in one tent. And so you have to say yes, but is that really what's being meant when the Bible asks that question, when it poses that idea that no one has seen God? The simplest answer, which may not be the best, and we could probably discuss it for a long period of time, but it does depend on what we mean as far as who has seen God. Let's give it in a different example. Has anyone ever seen heaven while they've been alive? In one sense, sure. It appears that Stephen gets a glimpse of heaven during his martyrdom, and certainly we have an entire book at the end of the New Testament that is a detailed account of things that happen in heaven rather than on earth. And so has John seen heaven? In a sense. But has anyone really seen heaven? Did the description that John give us the impression that he had seen it with full understanding, could describe it to us, spiritually speaking? Not so much. And so, has anyone seen God? When he chooses to appear in physical form, yes, they saw him. But has anyone seen God as he is? According to John chapter 4, what is God? God is spirit. If he chooses to appear in front of human eyes, can human eyes see what is spirit? They can't. But can they see what God chooses to show them? Well, sure. And so, the best that we get, to use the biblical illustration, is to see dimly in a mirror. We don't get to see the full glory of the spiritual God that he really is. What we get to see is a shadow almost of what we hope to see one day. And so the physical form is a far cry from the real thing. A vision, a voice, a dream, or even a physical manifestation right in front of our human eyes. It's just not quite the same. And so we can say fairly that no one has seen God, no one will see God until they are spirit themselves. And yet, there are some people in history that have come very close to God, and they've seen God as he chose to reveal himself to them. The other things we want to say, one, that God's primary purposes in interacting with humanity are always simple. And we've pretty well outlined them, but just to maybe summarize it as this story summarizes it, in this case, God comes to give life. Specifically, he comes to give life to Isaac. But isn't it true that God always gives life? We talked last week, actually, in one of the Psalms about God not just being able to move the mountains, but also being able to deliver the deer in the woods when no one's around. Well, the same thing is true here. All life comes from God, and so sometimes when God comes to this earth, it's just to give life. Ultimately, not just to Isaac, but to all who will come through him. The second reason he comes is to bless Abraham specifically. But again, he comes to bless Abraham and to come to bless the rest of the world through Abraham. And then again, the third thing we said is to judge. Through his justice, but certainly to condemn those who are deserving of it. And so again, when we look at our interaction with God, or with God's word even, what does his word come to do? And what does he come to do into this world? To give life, certainly. To bless, yeah, that as well. And to judge. And God can accomplish all of those things. And we just happen to see them all summarized here in this one text. One other text that's worth bringing up when talking about this story, because it gets paired so often with this story, is Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 2, where it tells us not to forget to entertain angels, well, not to forget to be hospitable. For doing so, some have entertained angels. Well, a lot of times people will turn back to Genesis 18 and they say, oh yes, okay, Abraham entertained angels. Well, I think that's fair. And I think, again, the conservative approach would say that he did entertain two angels, but he also entertained God himself. And so it's kind of a step above that. If I can suggest in very practical terms, if you're looking for a good example of someone entertaining angels, perhaps chapter 19 does a little better when Lot entertains a pair of angels. That wouldn't be the only example either that we could point to, but it may be a better example than chapter 18, where there's at least some question of exactly who it is that's appearing to Abraham. But regardless, this generalism that we shouldn't forget to be hospitable because we might be entertaining angels, it should be taken, the message should be the same, but it should also be taken with a little bit of care as to say, in all likelihood, we don't entertain angels today in the sense that Abraham and Lot did. But at the same time, the message there is still true, that we are hospitable. Why? Because we don't really know the results, we don't know the impact that we will have, and we certainly don't know the long-term impact that will result from our unwittingly entertaining strangers, whoever they may be. And it may be that it's a positive impact for them, it may be that it's a long-term positive benefit for us. But we do this because God commands it, but also because it can be beneficial. Just a couple more things. Number one, from this story, we learn that God is active. It's not that we necessarily take a fully deistic approach to God that says that he started the universe a turning and then he kind of backed off. But sometimes we do have a temptation to say, well, God is spiritual, he acts over here, and then there's the affairs of humanity. And this story shows that a lot of the time, maybe not as visibly as this, God is interacting, and he is crossing over those lines to the point of announcing to one family the birth of a child, announcing that he will continue his covenant with them, and even announcing the destruction of a city that's well deserving of it. And so God has a personal interaction with human events. Again, maybe not as visibly as we might want today, but certainly he does do this. And he may not appear under a grove of oak trees today to us. But if I can make the point on the other side of that, perhaps if we spent more time under the grove of oak trees, then maybe we'd find God speaking to us just a little bit more than we do when we stay as busy as possible in day-to-day life. And so understand what I mean there. Not necessarily that you'll hear the voice of God or see him in a vision, but certainly we could be listening a little bit more carefully when God is willing to speak. And that's the last thing we'll say, and it serves as God's invitation as well, that God is speaking to us even today. God speaks to us daily if we are willing to listen. The question for us this evening, for any of you who are here, what will you do with the life-changing encounter with God that you have available to you? Through his word on a daily basis, through interaction with Christians, what will you do when God speaks? This evening, if you need to respond to the words of God, this is your opportunity. If you need to put him on in baptism, wonderful. If you're not to that step yet, we'd love to talk to you about any other need that you have. Or if you're beyond that point and you have some other need that you need the church's help to address, or anything else, we ask that you come forward now as we stand, as we sing.